In Lisa Kheresh's dreamlike landscapes, names of towns and cities in Russia seem to offer the possibility of orientation, but we soon find ourselves lost in language again as references to other artists, places, animals, and images proliferate. Fortunately, here to guide us through her poetic world and her forthcoming collection is the author herself, Lisa Kheresh. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel, we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people, and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama, and poetry. In each episode, I invite an author or expert to give their views on a particular work of literature, and today I'm joined by Lisa Kheresh to discuss her debut poetry collection, My Boyfriend is Audre Lorde. I hope our conversation inspires you to read it, and if you have anything to say about the text or our conversation, please leave us a comment. If you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Lisa Kheresh is a poet and literary scholar, with her academic research focusing on Soviet-era underground communities and institutions. She's also a translator, working in Italian, German, Polish, Belarusian, and Yiddish, and translating those into both English and Russian, an impressive linguistic range. She was awarded the Andrei Bely Prize in 2023, and her debut poetry collection, My Boyfriend is Audre Lorde, will be published in autumn this year, 2025, so very soon, the time of this podcast being recorded. It's a pleasure to welcome Lisa to the World Literature Podcast. Lisa, very warm welcome to the podcast. Great to have you on and to be talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to talk to you.
My pleasure. So could you begin just by telling us a little bit about your poetry? Can you give a general sense of it? Who might be interested in reading it?
Okay, so I think it's important to mention that I'm originally from Moscow, and because of that, I was socialized as a poet among other Russian and Belarusian poets, and because of that, I think I'm sharing many traits according to the Eastern European and Russian and other Slavic poetry traditions. So, but it's also important to know that even though Slavic language is tradition, so the free verse came later to this tradition than, for example, in English, in German. Right now, it's the most prominent, the most popular way of writing among people that we call contemporary poets. And because of that, I mostly write in free verse. It's really unlikely to see me rhyming something. And who might be interested in it? Well, hard question, how poets can find their audience. But I think the second important part is that I'm also a literary scholar. So it's not only my pleasure to do in my free time, but also I'm dealing with literature, culture, and history every day at my lessons. And it's really intertwined. So my my academic career, and the thing that I'm interested as a poet. Yes, and because of that, I think my poetry can be interested to people who are also involved in culture from both sides. Poets, writers, and also scholars, translators, teachers. And because of that, I think that the most prominent features and theme in my poetry are history, relations between man and nature, human, animal, and also the questions of identity, like finding yourself in the history, and also questions of languages, maybe violence, and on the other hand, humanism. Yeah,
Thank
so
you. Great. Thanks for that introduction. And maybe we'll come back to your academic work a bit later because it sounds really interesting and talk about how that relates to the poetry. But as for the poetry itself, you started to answer, I think, a little bit what I was going to ask in my next question, which was just to give us
okay.
some context for your writing. I mean, you talked about sort of Slavic, Eastern European context. Can you give a bit more detail about how that influences your writing? And you mentioned free verse being very prevalent now. So do you think, okay, so you're sharing that form with other writers. Do you think you're also writing about the same themes as other poets of your generation in Russia or in, the sort of Slavic sphere? Yeah, so those are my questions for now.
Okay, so when I'm thinking about like some poetry groups that can be described as my like genealogical group, yeah, so this group that I'm inspired from, and the group that I'm not trying to follow, but maybe even unconsciously following them in some cases, I think it's important to mention two groups. So it's Leningrad underground poetry. This is the group of unofficial poets, writers, artists that were living in the second half of the 20th century in Soviet Leningrad. And the things that they were writing could not be published because of the both themes and the like life strategies of these people. So it could include like faith, any religious thematics, anything that is not that are not including this kind of like Soviet social realist uh, circle of themes,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And I think it's also important that with one of these poets, Yelena Schwartz, I was working as a scholar, and I'm still working. So I was writing, and I'm still writing about her poetry, about her I don't know, about, for example, her views according to the gender performance, to the faith, to the university. So I'm in deep investigation regarding her both poetry and life material. And because of that, I think in both sides I'm following her, but also I'm trying to not to be like her. So it's
Mm.
like it's very complex antagonistic relations between author that you're interested in as a scholar, and then you're seeing her more like not as a competitor but as someone that you can, for example, discuss something or disagree on something.
Mm. And
And this is
sorry,
yes.
yeah. No, you carry on. Yeah.
So, and this is Leningrad underground. The
Mm.
other group is is closer to me geographically.
Mhm.
It's called materialism. It's the movement that also has started in the second half of the 20th century, but in Moscow. It was not so unofficial, so could uh, they could have more like official relations. They could be published at some point and in some journals, and it consists of such poets as Alexei Parshikov, Alexander Yeremenko, Ivan Zhdanov, and I think like the most influential, not for me, but for whole generation and generation before me, Arkady Dragomoshenko.
Mm.
Even though he's not from Moscow, he's from Ukraine, and then he was studying in Leningrad, but that's another story. So that's it. I think that's the two most influential groups. And
Okay.
also, yes, yes. The last thing that I
Mm.
wanted to say to make this picture like whole. Uh, so, and there was a second generation of materialists,
Mm.
and they're even more influential to me, like Vladimir Aristov and Andrei Tavrov. So that's all.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, my follow-up question was going to be, so, you mentioned being influenced by these groups and presumably your academic work is on both of these groups. Is that right?
Yes.
So, but you also talked about, not following them exactly and doing things differently. Do you think the difference is, of course, I guess, is a matter of like, your personality and your personal style, but we're moving from the Soviet era to the post-Soviet era, so that seems to be, a huge shift. How how do you think that movement between historical periods comes out in the way that you follow or don't quite follow these earlier groups of poets?
Okay, great question. Thank you so much. So I think that very important thing about this group of poets, both group, but especially when it comes to Leningrad Underground, is their relation to politics, like not only electoral politics, but the ontological category of what is to be politically involved, what is to be political. Because of the Soviet regime, their like personal style regarding politics is what to not to like to be attention towards it, not to take part in some demonstration, and they were not calling themselves dissidents at most. Yeah, there were some other examples. For example, Natalia Gorbanevskaya, she was both a dissident and an underground poet, but people that I'm talking about, they were not calling themselves dissidents. So even though there were some episodes in their biographies when they were opposing like the Soviet epistemological regime, they were not like oppositions in a big way, right? And I think the same could be said about materialists. So even though, for example, in poetry of Alexei Parshakov, you could find poems like The Dogs of the Demonstrants, it is the title of one of his poems, they're not really involved in politics per se. And I think for my generation, it is very different. Firstly, because we live in another time, and secondly, because in some way, the same thing that has happened to the Polish Nova Fala, new wave, it also has happened to us. So what has happened to Nova Fala, it's at one time, in the 70s and the 80s, they realized that this hard, complex, philosophically enriched poetry, in some way, it's not true anymore. So it betrays trust that reader has towards poet that they are reading, and because of that, this opaqueness, this complexity was rejected, and there was a new generation of poets that were, on the contrary, using very simple sentences, simple language. And I think our generation has found some kind of compromise, some kind of middle ground, because right now, I don't think that I'm still involved in this kind of like hard metaphorical way of constructing a poem, but also it's important to me to have like a message that could be repeated and that could be at least partly understood. Yeah, so because of that, poems of the poets of my generation, they're not so dramatical, they're not closed. I think, on the contrary, they're trying to find its reader and to have some kind of contact. Yeah, so it's more communicative, but it's also hard and intellectual, right?
Yeah, yeah. And that takes me on quite nicely, or takes us on quite nicely to the next question I wanted to ask, which is about the poem Before Birds. So we'll go and talk specifically about some of the poems you so kindly recorded for us. We talked about the context and, the situation in Russia, previously in the Soviet Union. But, your own poetry, that context isn't necessarily foregrounded. And in this poem Before Birds, it feels quite abstract and difficult to place until we get to near the end, and there are two specific references to places, Lubyanka and Moscow. In the context of, I don't know if this is an acronym or if you say it as one word, GOELRO.
Uh,
Do you say it as
okay,
a word like
okay,
Guelro?
okay, okay, yeah. Uh,
How do you normally say that?
Guillermo.
Okay, so you do say it as a word, which was the electrification project in the Soviet
Yes,
Union, right?
yes,
Right.
yes, yes,
Yeah, so we
yes.
get these sort of contextual references coming in towards the end. So, I mean, is that kind of structure a result of the fact that it's kind of, were you trying to sort of, how to put this? Are you trying to escape that kind of national context, but then it comes back anyway? Or is are these references to places and events just things that are kind of hovering in the background? I suppose what I'm asking is what's the relationship between your poetry and the context of Russia and or the Soviet Union historically?
Okay. Also, great question. Thank you so much for that. Um, I think so. It's complex because on the one hand, these events and like this kind of national big history, big historical narratives, it surrounds me. I maybe I can try to escape it, but at the end of the day, I think I won't be able to do that. But it's also very important to work with this kind of material critically.
Hmm.
For me, it means not to be very centered around only my history, my narrative. Uh, and because of that, it is important to mention not only like Russian poets, that Russian Russophone poets that were influencing me originally,
Hmm.
but then also like many poets from other tradition, other languages that I was also reading very consciously, and I was trying to to consciously build this kind of genealogical tree of influence that would not include only Russophone poets, but also other tradition like
Hmm.
America, Polish, Italian. That's and I think that's the main reasons why I started to learn all of these languages and translating from them
Hmm.
because I wanted to know more about other ways people are working with word,
Hmm.
right? And because of that, I think that my poems are often very historically saturated. There are many details that could or could not be deciphered and to understood this way. And because of that, I'm trying to be very precise with the way how history appears in my poem and what could be said about these like historical elements.
Hmm.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. As part of that answer, you mentioned your efforts to acknowledge and I guess read poets from a wide range of contexts. Could maybe this is a good opportunity? Could you tell us a little bit about the journal that you edit and its relationship with your own writing?
So this journal we have, I was its editor for 3 years.
Mm.
And because of that, it was a great opportunity not to be only an author or a translator, but also an editor, because editor had has to have other like competence, other type of competence. So you should be able to work not only with poetry that you like personally, but also with poetry that you can find like helpful, find like that could contribute to your journal. And because of that, you have to make your like personal taste. You should wider it. You should make it more
Mm.
broader, and even maybe find some compromise between your taste and, for example, the thematical range of your own journal. But because of that, I had to work with so many poets and read so much that I would not be able to if not for the journal, right?
Mm,
Because now it's my duty, not as a poet, but as an editor.
mm,
And because of that, because of this, like, uh, I wanted to say passive, but I think it's active. Because of these active sessions of reading, uh, I think I became more competent in contemporary Russophone poetry and in translations from other languages to Russian. But also, I had great experience with, for example, communicating with other authors,
mm,
with understanding how, for example, an issue of a journal could look like,
mm,
was like structure. And yeah, I can say only good things about that. And
mm,
I think I wanted to say that I think every poet should be an editor. And I think that's not true because this is the situation in Russian cultural context when people have to be like everyone at once. They have to be
mm,
poet, editor, publisher, translator.
mm,
But maybe in ideal world, I would recommend every poet to be an editor, for example, for one issue, just to understand how it works, just to be more open to new names, to like the way of reading poetry that could sound not very familiar or habitual to you. So yeah,
mm.
this would be my advice.
Thank you. So, really interesting insights there. Yeah, I think yeah, editing stuff is always eye opening, isn't it? Yeah, when you're receiving the editorial feedback and you kind of get upset at the feedback somebody's giving you, but then you find yourself on the other side. You kind of you see it from that perspective as well. Let's change tack a little bit and talk about another poem, which is called "To All the Boys." So this poem represents boys, or at least interactions with boys, as a kind of experiment. But I think it also touches on the dangers of what's sort of come to be known in English, at least, as toxic masculinity. Is the poem, is it about a crisis of masculinity sort of here and now, you know, in the 2025? Or do you think much of what you wrote in that poem also applies to gender relationships throughout history? Yeah, so I suppose is it very much of this moment, or do you think it's talking about something that's more universal? And second question, why is boy in the written version? Why is boy always asterisked, or would answering that do too much work for the reader?
No, I think it wouldn't do too much work for the reader because I think it's a tradition like in Russian journalism, in Russophone journalism. So, for example, in some like journals that are dealing with the theme of contemporary culture, when they want to show that when they're talking about boys, men, women, and they include like everyone who is associating themselves with this gender, they would write it like with asterisk. So
Okay.
women asterisk, men asterisk, and here it was also so this kind of punctuation it reminds reader about that type of writing about like genders and culture, but
Mm,
also I think it's the ironic way
mm,
to speak about like very prominent but not contemporary problem, and also to have this asterisk as a reminder to the new ways of speaking about it, some
okay.
kind of play with the reader. And I think that like these problems that people are having while communicating with each other and trying to understand each other, it's prevalent in the modern world, but I think it could also be described as a like more existential problem, yes, to trying to understand another person, trying to understand like the other in
Mm,
philosophical brackets. And I think it's important that my poem is not like a compliance against boys that I was interacting, but on the contrary, it is a way to think about the possible allyship.
mm.
people, and and about some pain that comes into the play with the allyship. Yes, because
Mm.
people have different experience and different backgrounds, and sometimes we misunderstand each other. And because of that, I think it's also important to state that this poem. So I was trying to write it not as a like the poem that are describing isolation. Yes, so please don't interact with boys. Please don't have any relations with them, like romantic friends relation. No, it is not possible because they will always hurt you at the end. No, on the contrary, I was trying to say that. So sometimes it can be really hurtful to see and to feel this kind of disalignment, misunderstanding. But it's important when you are trying to look at that, like for example, as a gender scholar, and I have like minor in gender studies in my undergrad, so this theme definitely concerns me and interests me. It's important to look at things from different sides, to not to be very like direct in a way that deletes some nuances that are very important. So another thing about my poetry work, I think it's tricky when it comes to poetry because it can promise you very like light and simple answers, right? That are formulated in a way of like poetry utterance, and so this kind of like program sentences. And I'm trying to avoid it as much as I could. And on the contrary, I'm trying to formulate complex utterances, complex statements, to describe problems that I'm dealing with without blaming someone, because it's easy to blame someone. So,
Mm.
but I'm trying to be more nuanced and to formulate like with this poetry language that is very different from other type of languages. Uh, it's no wonder that Roman Jakobson described it as a text function, poetry
Mm.
function of the language. I'm trying to do like complex statement that could not be formulated in other type of speech. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for that really detailed and interesting answer. I think that's be a good time to take a break. So thank you so much
Okay.
for your answers. And everybody, please do join us for part two, where we'll talk about more of Lisa's poems.